On this spot in the Dublin Mountains, where Killakee Road and Military Road meet, a bizarre event unfolded in 1924 when, in front of a small crowd of locals, a man dubbed the penniless peer of the British Empire, whose family once owned vast tracts of land across Ireland, multiple mansions, and led a lavish lifestyle of social gatherings and shooting parties, was evicted from his grand mansion in the mountains. The soon-to-be 8th Baron Massy, who, having recently discovered that the family fortune was squandered, their land sold, and his title now worthless, took to his bed as the bank-appointed bailiffs knocked on the front door of Killakee House. Refusing outright to leave his home, the bailiffs picked up his mattress and carried the bankrupt Baron up the tree-lined avenue, where he was unceremoniously dumped on the side of the road while his former tenants looked on. Just 2 years before this strange event, as the country fell into the grips of a vicious civil war, and Hugh Hammond Massy found the hills around his stately home, once the playground of his ancestors, were now full of the hostile forces of the anti-treaty IRA. A controversial killing occurred when Massy shot a man in the study of Killakee House and was arrested and charged with the unlawful killing of Anthony Walsh. The question is, was it an act of self-defence or a cold-blooded killing, and was the case swept under the carpet by the newly formed Free State to avoid a diplomatic dilemma with the British government? What follows is the story of the 300-year Massy family dynasty in Ireland, their shocking fall from grace and the squandering of their vast wealth, the killing of Anthony Walsh in Killakee House, the humiliating downfall and eviction of Hugh Hammond, the 8th Baron Massy, and the beautiful woodland that now bears his name. Please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the next upload. These videos take weeks to research, film, narrate and edit, so I would greatly appreciate if you would consider sharing the video with a friend or family member who you think might enjoy the story. There is an old military road that winds its way up through the trees from Dublin City into the wild mountain land that for centuries was a refuge for rebels and a home to the dispossessed. Built to subdue unruly mountain residents, it makes its ascent towards the infamous Hellfire Club, where there is a sign on the left that bears the name Massy's Estate. Today, the deciduous woodland is a popular amenity for walkers. Its mature beech and sycamore trees are a surprisingly rare sight in a mountainscape of cultivated pine. This beautiful forest was once the private garden of a family belonging to an elite group of land-owning lords known as the Protestant Ascendancy. By 1900, the Massy family had spent the last 250 years in Ireland amassing land and wealth, and had lived the lavish lifestyle of the landed gentry, funded by the rental income provided by hundreds of Irish tenant farmers and labourers. The Massys could trace their lineage back to Normandy, France, from where their countrymen set out to conquer England, and the Anglo-Saxon king Harold Godwinson, under the leadership of William the Conqueror. Following his victory at the Battle of Hastings, William began confiscating lands from Anglo-Saxon owners and awarded these estates to families loyal to William the Conqueror, who included the de Massys, the ancestors of the Irish branch of the Massy family, who set up home at Dunham Castle in Manchester, where they were awarded with the title of Baron. The family became hugely influential in England and had many branches throughout Cheshire. 100 years later, the Normans would begin their conquest of Ireland, but it was not until the 1600s when the first Massy set foot on Irish soil. Captain Hugh Massy arrived in Ireland in 1641, following the outbreak of a Catholic rebellion led by Phelim O'Neill. Catholic landowners were outraged that their estates had been taken from them and awarded to Protestants, and sought to have their rights and possessions returned. Captain Hugh Massy, as a cavalry officer in the army of King Charles I, fought to crush the rebellion. What was hoped to be a quick coup instead turned into a bloody and prolonged war, and Ireland descended into chaos. Massy returned to England the following year, where he abandoned Charles I and chose the side of the parliamentarians on the outbreak of the English Civil War. He returned to Ireland 5 years later and continued to fight against the Catholic rebels. On the 16th of August 1649, Oliver Cromwell, the newly appointed Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, landed in Dublin with an army of thousands to put a brutal end to the rebellion. For his support of Cromwell during this period, Captain Massy was awarded several thousand acres of land in Limerick that had been confiscated from Catholics. Here he built a manor house in Duntralig and married Margaret Percy. The couple named their firstborn son Hugh, a family tradition that would survive right up until the 20th century and the downfall of the family at Killakee House. Through the generations that followed, the Massys increased their land, wealth and influence, becoming a prominent and powerful member of the Protestant ascendancy class. In 1776, a new title in the peerage of Ireland was created by King George III, and the great-grandson of Captain Massy, who had fought alongside Oliver Cromwell, became Lord Massy, the Baron of Duntralig. The story of Killakee House began in 1800 when Luke White, an exceedingly wealthy bookseller, purchased land in the Dublin Mountains from the Connolly family. Some 75 years earlier, William Connolly had constructed a hunting lodge on the top of Mount Pellier Hill that became known as the infamous Hellfire Club. However, by 1800, it was already a ruin. Luke White set about building a 36-room, stucco-faced mansion in the style of a Mediterranean villa. The beautiful gardens surrounding the house were greatly improved by Luke's son Samuel when he commissioned Sir Ninian Niven, director of the Botanic Gardens, to lay out 2 formal gardens. The gardens included water fountains, statues, a walled garden, and glass houses designed by Richard Turner, who also designed the famous Palm House in Kew Gardens and the curvilinear glass house of the Botanic Gardens in Dublin. The glasshouses contained many exotic species of plants, and you can still find the remains of the stone foundations and irrigation system in the woodland. No expense was spared by the Whites, who were one of the richest families in Ireland, and also owned several other estates, including Luttrellstown Castle. The White family were relatives of the Massys. The 4th Baron Massy married Luke White's daughter Matilda in 1826, and in 1880 the house at Killakee was in the ownership of Anne White, the widow of Samuel White. Anne decided to leave the grand home to her nephew, John Thomas, the 6th Baron Massy, and so began the story of the Killakee Massys. The 6th Baron was an immensely wealthy man, having inherited tens of thousands of acres of land in Leitrim and Limerick. He had never expected to become Baron, as he was the second-born son in the family, and had inherited the title on the death of his older brother Hugh Inglesby, who had died prematurely and without producing an heir in 1874. John Thomas possessed more money and land than any of his predecessors, and during his tenure as Baron, Killakee House would become a lavish mountain retreat, and an integral part of the social calendar of the ascendancy. The sixth Baron dedicated his life to the sporting pursuits of fishing and shooting, and to entertaining his equally wealthy friends. In Limerick, he owned rights to salmon fishing on a section of the Shannon, and became the most distinguished salmon fisherman on that important reach of the Shannon. In Killakee, the Baron's shooting parties became legendary, and during the season, droves of wealthy guests were invited to the estate. The Baron kept a fleet of carriages on standby to bring his guests up to the house and then out into the mountains, where an army of beaters walked through the gorse and ferns to flush out the pheasant and grouse, sending them flying towards the guns of the waiting men. Meanwhile, the servants of the house laid out dining tables in the trees and brought food from the house so the sportsmen could dine in style in the open air. The sixth Baron rarely involved himself in politics. He had little interest in taking up a seat in the House of Lords, and when he did attend, he showed even less interest in taking part in debates. For him, life revolved around his social calendar. Working for money was not a concept he was familiar with, as it seemed to him that he had an endless supply to fund his lifestyle. From the beginning of his life, his needs were met by an army of servants, and Killakee House was no different. The census of 1901 and 1911 showed that the residents of the house were greatly outnumbered by servants. The census lists the staff of butlers, cooks, and housemaids by name and religion, and gives us an insight into the views of the Massy family and the ascendancy as a whole. Catholics, who would have made up the majority of the Lord's tenants, were not trusted or permitted by John Thomas Massy to work inside the house as servants, and everyone on his staff belonged to the Church of Ireland. It seems that the sixth Baron did not spend too much time thinking about the future of his family, and as times began to change and the issue of land ownership became increasingly contentious, he continued to party and spend the family's wealth, while the world slowly began to change around him. In 1870, only 3% of Irish farmers owned the land they worked, while 97% were tenants on estates such as those owned by the Massys. A series of land acts were introduced to allow tenants to purchase their land, and the sixth Baron Massy, who had been burning through the family fortune, began selling off land. While the lump sums from the various sales were substantial, it also meant that the family's future income from rent was greatly reduced, and their future prosperity would rely on these funds being wisely invested. The sixth Baron Massy, however, had no intention of tightening his belt, and he continued to live as if the money would never run out, and the two troubled generations that followed would find themselves dealing with the consequences of his actions. "253 years after Captain Massy arrived in Ireland for the first time, and 11 hues later, the man who would become the troubled 8th Baron Massy was born in Killakee in 1894. Hugh Hammond Charles George Massy was born on the 13th of July that year, while his grandfather, the 6th Baron, was still the patriarch of the family. He lived with his parents in Ardfinnan House in Tipperary, and, as was the family tradition, he was sent to boarding school in Harrow in England. Hugh Hammond often joined his grandfather's shooting parties at Killakee, and it seemed to both him and his parents that all was well, and he would inherit his title and wealth in due course. However, when the 6th Baron died in 1915, the family were faced with a shocking revelation. Not only had the family fortune been squandered, but they found that they were also massively in debt to the bank, who, unbeknownst to them, had been funding the 6th Baron's lifestyle for quite some time. Much of the land that provided rental income had been sold, and the 7th Baron was left with several grand houses, all with a litany of servants and garden staff that needed huge investments of money to run. Sometime after the death of his grandfather, Hugh Hammond took up residence in Killakee House, but life there bore little resemblance to the one he remembered from his childhood. His father had been forced to let go of the vast majority of his staff, as he simply could not afford to pay them. Gone were the butlers, housemaids and cooks. The grand gardens were no longer tended to. The lawns became overgrown, and trees began to reclaim the walled gardens, while the beautiful glass houses rusted and cracked without repair. The 36 rooms of the Mediterranean mansion that once hosted the most extravagant parties of the Ascendancy social calendar fell silent, as did the estate guns. There would be no more shooting parties at Killakee. Despite the family's financial problems, Hugh Hammond enjoyed his early days at Killakee. He was a handsome, affable and stylish young man with an allowance from his father and a beautiful motor car left at the estate by his grandfather. Unlike many men of his generation, he did not enlist in the army on the outbreak of World War I due to bouts of ill health that occasionally required hospital treatment. The future Baron had also developed a fondness for alcohol in his teenage years, and as he grew older it developed into a serious long-term addiction. As World War and a revolution in Ireland changed the world around him, Hugh Hammond settled into life in his mountainside home, but trouble lay ahead for the future Baron who had once been promised so much. For many in the ascendancy class, the preservation of their way of life relied heavily on the marriage of their children to suitable partners of a similar rank and religion, and as heir of the title of Baron Massy, it was expected that Hugh Hammond would find a Protestant wife from a wealthy family. His parents were shocked and dismayed to learn that he had met, fallen in love with, and was determined to marry a nurse who had taken care of him in hospital and was willing to convert to Catholicism to do so. To add insult to injury, not only was Margaret Moran a Catholic, she was also a widow with 3 young children. This was a serious problem for his parents, for if Hugh Hammond and Margaret Moran had a son together, there was the distinct possibility that the 9th Baron Massy would be a Catholic. Despite the protests of his parents, Hugh Hammond and Margaret Moran married in Newman University Church on St. Stephen's Green in 1919. In late 1920, Margaret became pregnant with the couple's first child, and the following summer, the worst fears of Hugh's parents were realised when Hugh Hammond John Somerset, their newborn grandson and the future 9th Baron Massy, was baptised in the Catholic Church of the Annunciation in Rathfarnham. To Hugh Hammond's parents, it seemed as though their lives and legacy were unravelling before their eyes. His mother Ellen would never forgive him for this act of treachery, and on her death, Hugh found that she had excluded him from her will. Hugh Hammond and Margaret began their life together in Killakee House during one of the most tumultuous periods of Irish history. The year that they married marked the beginning of the Irish War of Independence, and the mountains that surrounded their home were soon full of active units of the Irish Republican Army. Families like the Massys, who lived in the big houses of Ireland, represented the old and unjust system of landlordism and were deeply threatened by the idea of Ireland becoming an independent republic. Killakee House found itself to be in an isolated position, far from the relative safety of the city, and the 8th Baron was to come face to face with Republican forces on several occasions during both the War of Independence and the Civil War. Houses such as the one in Killakee were known to contain weapons and vehicles that were badly needed by the volunteers and were frequently targeted to acquire them. Many ascendancy families left the country entirely, and big houses across Ireland were burnt to the ground, including the Hermitage in Limerick, a former residence of the 6th Baron. Killakee House too was raided on several occasions, and in 1922, shortly after the outbreak of the Civil War, it was targeted once more by anti-treaty forces who cut the phone lines, raided the house, and took possession of the car that Hugh Hammond had inherited from his grandfather. Although Hugh, Margaret, and their children were never harmed during these raids, it surely must have been a frightening experience to see armed men entering their home to take their possessions. Little did the Baron know that sequestered on his estate lands, not far from the house, was a significant arms dump used by the IRA. Had the family not been in such dire financial straits by this time, it is likely that they may have relocated to the city or to England. Despite the big house, title and car, the Massys were struggling to get by in 1922, and many of the 36 rooms of the house were completely bare, as paintings, silverware and furniture had been auctioned off just so the family could get by. The following evening, as the couple tried to come to terms with the raid, and feeling more isolated than ever, having lost their car and their phone line, they began to prepare for bed. At 11:30, when the last traces of summer light had faded from the sky, Margaret Massy undressed in the flicker of a small nursery oil lamp when she thought she heard the sound of footsteps approaching on the gravel of the monkey puzzle-lined avenue that led to the house. Within a few minutes, a strange man would lie dead on the floor of the study with a gaping gunshot wound in his chest, and Hugh Hammond Massy would soon find himself under arrest and charged with the unlawful killing of Anthony Walsh. Anthony Walsh was familiar with the winding roads of the Dublin Mountains, as he had grown up on the other side of the hill that is topped by the Hellfire Club in a village called Piperstown. But this was the first time he had dared to pass through the front gates of Killakee House. Described in the press and by his sister as a traveller, he was likely to have been a travelling salesman of some description. But what exactly his intentions were on this evening were as yet unknown. Margaret, fearing yet another raid, called out to Hugh, who took the oil lamp from the side of the bed and made his way to a window that overlooked the avenue. He opened the window and shouted, "Hello, who is there?" A reply came from the darkness. "Is that you, Mr. Massy? I want to speak to you." Hugh Massy went down the stairs and approached the front door of Killakee House. It is worth noting at this point that the following description of what happened next is based entirely on the statements of Hugh and Margaret Massy, as the only other witness to the event would soon be dead. Hugh opened the door and Anthony Walsh entered the house and was questioned as to what he wanted at such a late hour. Walsh stood in the study with one hand in the pocket of his coat and began to ask Hugh for money. Initially, he was refused, but according to Hugh, the man then became violent and threatening when he was told to leave the house. Although Hugh could not see a gun, Walsh continued to keep one hand in his pocket. Hugh left the intruder in the study and returned to Margaret in the bedroom to fetch the key for the safe. He told her of the man's demands for money, and he then returned to the study, where he opened the safe and took out a £5 note. Hoping this would appease the intruder, he handed it to Walsh, who, seeing the open safe, became even more aggressive and tackled Hugh Hammond as he tried to direct him to the door. At this point, Margaret came down the stairs and pleaded with the man to leave the house and to not harm her babies. A struggle continued between the two men. Hugh pushed him away and ran towards his desk, where he retrieved his loaded Webley revolver, and as Walsh rushed at him once more, he fired a shot over his head. Walsh ducked and grabbed onto Hugh Hammond's legs when a second shot was fired, and Anthony Walsh collapsed to the ground. Margaret knelt down next to the injured man and, seeing the obvious wound in his chest, began to pray as Anthony Walsh bled to death on the floor of Killakee House. Hugh Hammond, although in a state of shock, managed to send for a doctor and a priest who arrived shortly afterwards. There was nothing the doctor could do for Anthony, and the priest led the small group in prayer over the dead body. Hugh and Margaret were in a state of severe distress, as witnessed by many over the next few days. They did, however, have the presence of mind to call for the priest and doctor, and yet strangely, at no point did they attempt to contact the police. The body of Anthony Walsh lay where it had fallen on the floor of the study, covered in blood, for the next 24 hours. Rumours began to spread down the valley that a shooting had taken place in Killakee, and soon they reached the ears of a local police officer named James Hughes, who then made his way up to the home of Hugh and Margaret Massy. When he entered the house, he saw the dead body of Anthony Walsh still lying where it had fallen, 3 yards from the safe. A clearly distraught Hugh Hammond Massy then handed him the large Webley revolver he had taken from his desk. The scene was then attended by Lieutenant Kinsella of the Criminal Investigations Department from Oriel House on Westland Row. The pockets of the dead man's clothing were searched, revealing that he had been unarmed, and Hugh Hammond Massy was placed under arrest for the suspected unlawful killing of Anthony Walsh. The body of Anthony Walsh was taken to a morgue in Rathmines, where the remains were identified by Annie Walsh, the dead man's sister, while Dr. Brennan, the county coroner, set about organising an inquest into the death that would be held in Rathmines Town Hall the following Saturday. In the meantime, Hugh Hammond was released on bail. He engaged the services of solicitor E.H. Byrne and began to prepare himself for the inquest. A curious crowd gathered on Saturday morning, the 22nd of July 1922, in a recently built courtroom at the rear of Rathmines Town Hall to witness the strange sight of a soon-to-be Baron present his side of the story. Both Hugh Hammond and Margaret Massy were present with their solicitor, Mr. Byrne, while Mr. R.C. Lynham appeared on behalf of the Irish Free State Government. The courtroom was crowded and stuffy on that warm day in July, and the atmosphere was not improved by the odious smells from the morgue in the room below that crept up through the floorboards and into the nostrils of those who had gathered. First to give evidence at the inquest was Annie Walsh, sister of the dead man, who confirmed his identity and told the court that she had not seen Anthony for several weeks. She did not know where he was living and had no idea why he had been in Killakee the previous Wednesday. Officer James Hughes described the Webley revolver that Hugh Hammond had handed to him when he arrived on the scene. With it, there were 2 empty shells, plus 1 misfired shell. The account of the incident Hugh Hammond had given to the police, and the one he was about to reiterate at the inquest, involved 2 shots being fired from the weapon. The first one intentional, the second one accidental and fatal. However, he had clearly attempted to fire the weapon on 3 separate occasions. Lieutenant Kinsella told the court that on searching the dead man's body, he did not find any weapons, but instead he found a £5 note, allegedly the one given to him by Massy, and what appeared to be a skeleton key. He also told of the visible distress he witnessed on the faces of both Hugh and Margaret. Dr. Albert Crowley of Rathfarnham described the gaping gunshot wound on Walsh's chest, the several broken ribs he had found, the mass of blood in the chest, and he attributed the death to hemorrhage due to the effects of the bullet wound. The jury were told of the Massy's version of events from the evening in question: the uninvited visitor, the demand for money, the scuffle between the 2 men, and the firing of the accidental shot that killed Walsh. He then conveyed to the court Hugh Hammond's deepest sympathy for the family members of the dead man and assured them that the killing was purely accidental and had caused him great distress. Hugh Hammond Massy's account of the evening was accepted by the court, and he walked out of Rathmines Town Hall past the members of the press who were gathered outside and returned home to Killakee. There were several questions left unanswered about that evening, however. Why had the Massys failed to contact the police following the death? Was it due to shock? And if it was, how had they managed to contact a priest and a doctor? Was it due to fear of the new police force of the Free State? The Royal Irish Constabulary was almost fully disbanded by this stage, and a fledgling Garda Síochána, then called the Civic Guard, was staffed by many ex-members of the IRA. Or was the killing not quite as accidental as he portrayed it? Hugh Massy claimed that he fired 1 shot intentionally and the second shot had gone off accidentally, yet the presence of the misfired round showed that he had pulled the trigger a total of 3 times. Despite these questions, Hugh Hammond Massy would face no further investigation into the killing of Anthony Walsh. In the early days of the Free State, the delicate diplomatic relationship with the UK and the remaining presence and threat of the British Army in Ireland meant that putting a future Baron on trial for an unlawful killing just wasn't worth the trouble it would cause. Strangely, this was the second inquest within 2 years in which Hugh Hammond was involved. In 1920, while driving his car through Dalkey, he ran over and killed a 3-year-old boy. At the inquest that followed, a verdict of accidental death was declared, and Hugh Hammond was exonerated from all blame. What exactly Anthony Walsh's intentions were that night will never be known for sure. He didn't have any connection with the IRA. Was he just an opportunistic thief who had heard that the phone lines had been cut, or was he just hoping to find some charity at the door of the Massys? Despite the relief that this ordeal was over, there was to be little peace for the Massy family. When they returned to Killakee, all their financial troubles were still waiting for them, and they were soon to get much worse. They continued on with life as best they could for the next few years. When money was particularly short, they sold off whatever heirlooms remained in the house to make ends meet. Hugh Hammond's mother had died a year after the shooting incident and had left him out of her will. In the end, it made no financial difference, as it turned out that she had nothing to leave him anyway. The Munster and Leinster Bank, who were owed thousands of pounds by the family, realised that the debts were never going to be repaid, and set their eyes on Killakee House and the estate lands that surrounded it. In 1924, an eviction order arrived at the door of the Massy family. Hugh Hammond was completely overwhelmed by what was taking place, and for the next few months he spent much of his time in bed. He claimed to be too ill to leave the house, and he successfully delayed the repossession for several months. The bank soon became suspicious, however, and a doctor was sent to assess his condition. He was found to be in good health, and the bank was given the green light to proceed. When the dreaded knock on the door finally came, on the 15th of May 1924, Hugh Hammond Massy was still laying in his bed, and he had no intention of moving. He clung onto the desperate hope that an ill man could not be evicted from his sick bed. The bank-appointed bailiffs told Hugh that there was an ambulance waiting outside for him, but still he refused to move, exclaiming that, "I will never leave this house unless you carry me out." The bailiffs moved forward, each taking a hold of a corner of the mattress, and, lifting Hugh Hammond up into the air, carried him down the stairs, and began to make their way along the avenue towards the nearest gate, where a sawmill and a cafe now stand. The arrival of the bailiffs and an ambulance had been noticed by a group of curious locals who now stood on the roadside opposite the gate, and as they peered down the avenue to see what was happening, they were shocked to see Hugh Hammond Massy still on his mattress, being carried towards the gate. The future 8th Baron was then deposited on the side of the road in front of the onlookers, many of whom had been his tenants, while the keys of the mansion were handed over to a caretaker who then moved into the house. Both shocked and humiliated, Hugh Hammond stayed on the side of the road with Margaret and the children for quite some time. As he sat in silence, he recalled how just 9 years earlier, a row of carriages had lined up on this same spot to bring so many distinguished guests to his grandfather's final shooting party, and yet here he sat, broke and homeless, and the life he had always been promised was vanishing before his eyes. Eventually, some friends arrived on the scene, and the family were taken by car to a hotel in the city. It seems that there was some good feeling towards the Massys in Killakee, as Margaret and the children were taken in by one local family and Hugh by another. After some negotiation, the bank agreed to let the family keep a small gate lodge called Beehive Cottage, and it was here that Hugh Hammond Massy would live the rest of his life. The 3-roomed cottage was a dramatic step down from the 36-room Mediterranean villa the family were accustomed to, but at least they now had somewhere to call home. The next problem they faced was finding enough money for food. Hugh Hammond was completely broke, and the 30-year-old had never had to work for a living. He also had a well-known drinking problem, and his attempts to find work all failed. When his father died in 1926 and Hugh became the 8th Baron Massy, he was probably hopeful that his inheritance would bring some reprieve from their dire situation, but this was not to be the case. The heir to the title of one of the wealthiest landowning families in Ireland inherited just £10 plus some new and unpayable debt. He did not use his title when seeking work in bars and shops, but when prospective employers discovered that Mr. Massy was actually Lord Massy, the man now dubbed the penniless peer by the newspapers, they refused to hire him. Thankfully for Hugh Hammond, his wife Margaret was a strong and resilient woman with far more experience of the working world. Margaret, who had never used her title of Lady Massy, soon found work in the sweepstakes office and supported her husband and children, a detail the newspapers found particularly amusing. Her long daily commute required her to walk or cycle down the valley, catch a bus into town, and then make the return journey up the steep hill to Killakee. For the next 3 decades, Hugh Hammond Massy spent his days wandering through the trees of what was to become known as Massy's Wood, as he watched his former home slowly fall further into disrepair, and the once manicured gardens were reclaimed by nature. He busied himself collecting wood to heat the little cottage during the freezing cold winter months, using an old orange box with wheels attached as a makeshift cart. In 1937, the Leitrim Observer published an interview with Lord Massy, who spoke to the reporter about his lonely days in Killakee. Lord Massy, a slim, frail figure, once heir to historic estates, is now the penniless tenant of the gate lodge of his ancestral home. He told me that he kept house for years while his wife went out to earn her living. He wore a battered green felt hat, an old brown sports coat, and blue lounge trousers. From under the hat came fugitive black locks. Hard to believe that this was 41-year-old Lord Hugh Hammond Massy. For years County Leitrim have tried to find him, for rates they claim have accumulated for 12 or 14 years on the mountain estate of 1,200 acres. I found him today in a cottage high up on a lonely Dublin Mountains slope. For years he has lived here, keeping house, a daily round of scrubbing floors, making beds, cooking, while his wife walked or cycled several miles to earn 35 shillings a week at a clerical job at the offices of the Irish Sweepstakes authorities. The rest of his time? He walks about the deserted grounds, sees the shuttered windows of the empty castle, the weed-grown drive, the untrimmed mansion front. 13 years ago, Lord Massy, now plain Mr. Hugh Massy, was too ill to understand that he had to leave the home of his ancestors. So ill was he that on the way to Dublin, the driver of the car in which he travelled refused to continue the journey to the city until a doctor had examined the peer's heart and certified that it was still strong enough to last out the journey to hospital. We talked today in the poorly furnished little bedroom that serves as his sitting and living room. His 16-year-old son, Hugh Hammond Somerset Massy, helped to prepare his own and his father's modest meal. Hugh is a student at Clongowes College, where he is being kept at the expense of friends and his mother. He does not use his title at school. Lord Massy told me, "My wife and I were married about 17 years ago, but in recent years she has been the sole support of the home. We have no other income except what she gets from her job at the sweepstakes office." I asked Lord Massy why had he discarded his title. He smiled wryly and said, "What use is a title to a pauper? The humblest farm labourer around here is happier than I am. At least people will employ him. I would do anything to earn a living, but because they get to know of my title, they will not have me. A few months ago, I tried to get a job as a bar porter, but when the job seemed mine, they heard of my title and that finished it. Life has almost ceased to be worth living. The loneliness of my life here becomes almost unendurable. You see, I live like a hermit, see practically no one all day. There are days when life seems blacker than ever, when I feel I shall go mad. Then I take a grip on myself, because it does a man no good to brood too much on himself. Lord Massy rarely ventures far afield from his home. In the last 4 years, he has been in Dublin less than 4 times. My chief interest in life now is my son. I myself was educated at Harrow and was meant for the army, but family troubles made it impossible for me to have any career. I should like my son to join the Royal Navy, but I fear it is too expensive. I cannot even buy him a suit of clothes. I was not aware that I had any property in Leitrim. Perhaps if I scrape up enough money, I may go and see it. I do not see any prospect, however, of paying off the rates which have accumulated on it. Any sum, no matter how small, would be too big for me to pay. If I had £1 at this moment, I think I would spend it on a radio crystal set, which would help me to endure the monotony of the long winter nights up here. In the summer, when trippers start coming up to the mountain, we serve them with cheap teas. That helps a little. I can help to prepare and serve them. He showed me 1 or 2 slips on cardboard on which he had printed rough advertisements to attract the trippers. Later I spoke to Lady Massy at her work in the Exchequer Street branch of the sweep offices. I do not use my title. I am simply known to the girls here as Mrs. Massy. My wages are not remarkably high, but the job is worth having. I find it impossible to get anything else. Beggars cannot be choosers. As a peer of the realm, Lord Massy had received an invitation to attend the coronation of King George VI in Westminster Abbey in 1937. When asked if he planned to attend, he responded, "I have not enough money to take me to the nearest pub, never mind to London for the coronation." Since the eviction in 1924, the bank had been trying to sell Killakee House, but they had been unable to find a buyer, as the running costs of such a large home were prohibitive. Finally, in 1941, the house was sold to a builder for salvage. Everything of value was stripped from the property, and as Lord Massy watched from the window of a small cottage, his 36-room home was demolished. Today, the only traces of Killakee House are the few ruins dotted around the woodland and the foundations and walls of the enclosed garden and glasshouse that have been fully reclaimed by nature. The 8th Baron Massy spent the rest of his life in Beehive Cottage, haunted by the ruins of his estate and the demise of his family, and died in the cottage on the 20th of March 1958, aged 63. According to those who lived in Killakee, Hugh Hammond had always been a polite and friendly man to those he encountered. He had the terrible misfortune to inherit his title following the disastrous and selfish actions of his grandfather, who squandered the family fortune without a thought for his future heirs, and to witness the family's final and humiliating downfall. Following a funeral service in the Church of the Annunciation in Rathfarnham, Lord Hugh Hammond Massy was laid to rest in the family vault in Castle Connell in County Limerick. His son, now the 9th Baron, returned to Beehive Cottage for the funeral, having moved to England, where he set up a grocery business and was interviewed there by reporters. Apart from the Gate Lodge and the title, the new Lord Massy is not sure what he has inherited on the death of his father. There may be some other property around Ireland somewhere, he said. I don't know. I think it is all gone. Lady Massy, sitting by the fire in the Gate Lodge, said, I doubt there is any property left. He had thousands of acres in Leitrim, but he never even saw it. The property has been taken over by the Irish Land Commission. I think all we have now is the Gate Lodge. Hugh Somerset then told the reporter that, I am going back to my wife and 4 sons in England. I have a business there, and it is my job to look after it. There is nothing left for us here. Beehive Cottage was sold 2 years later, and Margaret Massy left Ireland for Leicester to live close to her son and grandchildren. And 319 years after Captain Massy landed in Ireland, his dynasty came to an end. Margaret Massy died in 1978, aged 78. It is safe to say that without her strength and support, Hugh Hammond Massy would not have been able to survive for so long following the eviction.